Good afternoon, everyone. This is Susan with PACE. I just want to let you know that we are going to wait to start for a little bit and let everyone file in. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, well, we got the all clear from Susan to go ahead and get started. My name is Craig Sell. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PACE Chat sponsored today by our Diamond partner, Neustar. The topic of the discussion today is how to get an A in stir-shaken attestation. Our speakers are Bart Pesavento, Director of Product Marketing at Neustar, and Henry Hayter, Product Director at Neustar. Welcome, Bart. Welcome, Henry, to this chat.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.
All right, so why don't we get started? My name is Bart Pesavento. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Neustar. And as Craig mentioned, I'm joined today by Henry Hayter. He's the Product Director here at Neustar. And what we're going to be talking about is attestation elevation and why getting an A in stir shake and helps your calls get answered. And we're going to talk about how you do that and a couple of different other things. So let's get started. So here's our agenda for today. First, we're going to go through stir shake and a quick review on that, just to understand, everyone have a common understanding of the terminology that we're using. And we're just going to go through that pretty quickly to understand how stir shake and way it works and just, again, the terminology. We're going to go through what some of the key market drivers are. What are we seeing in the industry? We're going to talk about attestation elevation. What exactly is it? How do you overcome this attestation gap? And we're going to talk about end-to-end authentication. And then we're also going to talk about elevating the call experience. How do we go beyond just authenticating calls? And then we're going to talk about next steps. And then we're going to finish off with some Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over to Henry. He's going to take us through stir shaking.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Henry Hayter. As mentioned, I run the certified caller line of business at Neustar, which is essentially everything to do with stir shaken. So the first thing I wanted to start off with, because I recognize that not everybody may be completely familiar with stir shaken as a technology or as what the sort of functional output of stir shaken is, and so I wanted to kind of clarify a few elements of that. So first of all, stir shaken is a framework of two different technologies. Stir, which is secure telephony over the internet revisited, which is the concept of securing the calling and called party identity at the point of origination of the phone call, using standard cryptography, right? Using a private key to encrypt the contents of that identity header, and then publishing a public key that can be used by the terminating provider to decrypt those contents and ensure that the identity header that's part of the SIP message, the session initiation protocol message that transits the call across the VoIP network, the numbers, the calling numbers and the called numbers have not been manipulated from what they were at the point of origin, right? Which is the sort of common attack preference of spoofers is to do sort of either a man in the middle attack or or to basically just outright steal the number. And so the Shaken framework is essentially the regulatory / technical framework that's used to ensure that the signing party is actually authorized to sign the calls, right? And so the Shaken framework is essentially a framework whereby the FCC determines who can and can't sign calls, and basically provides a key to authorized carriers that allow them to do call authentication and assign an attestation level, and then likewise to do verification and assign call treatment before they send a call out to the terminating subscriber. So the way it works in sort of a practical practical basis is the calling party makes a call, whether that comes from a call center or subscriber. It goes to the originating carrier. The originating carrier is going to have a set of policies there that determine what level of attestation that call is going to get. And we'll dig into that a little bit later in the presentation. They basically will then secure the calling and called identity and the attestation value and encrypt it, and then send it along the call path. So that way it's encrypted so that if it passes through transit carriers, they don't have a reason to modify it. So they pass the identity header along intact. And then when it gets to the terminating carrier, they unlock that encryption, verify it, and then decide what to do with the call. If it has a high level of attestation, then it gives a verification status that the call has been verified. And we'll get into a number of ways that this is presented, but it's kind of like hinted here on the right. What you'll see sort of as STIR/SHAKEN becomes more ubiquitous on a landline phone, in front of the caller name, you'll see like a bracket and V for verified, right? And then on a mobile phone, depending on whether it's Android or iOS and what model of Android and what carrier, you'll see some kind of indicator, right? Some kind of check mark somewhere on the device, either on the incoming call screen or in the call log or both, where there will be a check mark that indicates that call was verified from end to end with STIR/SHAKEN. And so that's really the objective of STIR/SHAKEN is to make sure that when the call gets to this calling party, that the originating number that was secured by the carrier is actually the originating caller ID that's being delivered. So to boil it down, it's kind of an anti-spoofing technology today. It has a very robust roadmap that we'll talk about later to provide additional value in terms of enterprise identity in particular. Go to the next slide. So what does attestation mean, right? So the carriers today are responsible based on the SHAKEN framework for assigning an attestation. And you can think of an attestation as just a level of trust, right? The highest level of trust is going to result in an A-level attestation. And there's essentially three criteria that the carrier needs to be able to say, needs to be able to meet in order to give an A-level attestation. The first is that they need to be able to definitively identify that it was their customer that made the call, right? So typically, they're going to do this by, associating a customer ID with an inbound trunk group or something like that. The second one, and this one is important, is that I gave them this telephone number. It could be that the number came from their own TN inventory. If they're a carrier that gets numbers from the North American numbering plan, or they could lease numbers from a wholesaler. But as long as the carrier assigned that number to that customer, then they know that call is being used in a legitimate fashion. And the last is that the call originated on their network. So the carrier needs to differentiate their sort of transit group trunks, if they act as a transit carrier at any point, from their sort of ingress trunks where their customers connect into. So a good example of a call that would get an attestation level A is there's a direct business relationship. The call comes across the originating service provider's network using a TN that they know because it's in their inventory or it was assigned to that customer by that carrier. And it's typically where you'll see that is in a direct business relationship for consumers, right? So it'll be very unusual to see like a mobile to mobile call from an AT&T mobile subscriber to a T-Mobile subscriber not be STIR/SHAKEN verified, because it's very easy to identify the relationship between the phone number and the person that's using it. Also, if you're a business and you have a single provider, you get all your phone numbers from one telco, you send all your voice traffic to one telco, then it's pretty easy for them to identify you and give you an A-level attestation. That being said, the next level down, attestation B, has the primary difference here is that, you know, you still have the requirement that the calling party needs to be the customer of the carrier, and they still need to see the call origination happening on their network. But if they don't recognize the phone number, then they should assign that call an attestation level B, right? And so, and where you'll see this in a lot of cases is where, you know, the TNs, the telephone numbers that the customer is using, either they multi-source their telephone numbers, they get telephone numbers from different providers, or they use different types of technologies in their telco strategy, like least cost routing, or they use you know, different calling platforms that use the same numbers. You'll see also the use of 1-800 numbers, of toll-free numbers that don't map to the North American numbering plan. And you'll see that a lot of those calls, because the originating carrier doesn't recognize the calling number, a lot of those calls will get a B attestation. Attestation C is really reserved for transit traffic, where, you know, the person who's signing the call doesn't really know where the call came from. They're acting as a transit provider. They're putting a stamp on it because they have a regulatory obligation to sign the call, but they're not making any attestation about the identity of the caller. So it's rare to see an attestation level C. What we see mostly today in the STIR/SHAKEN environment post June 30th, and in Canada in the run up to November 30th, is we see mostly attestation level A and attestation level B being placed. The key difference between attestation level A and attestation level B is that attestation A results in a parameter being passed to the end device called the VERSTAT, the verification status. And the value that's passed in that verification status is TN validation equals true, right? Or TN validation passed. That's what drives the visibility of the V in the brackets or the check marks, is that VERSTAT parameter. So on a call that gets an attestation level B, there's no reason for the terminating carrier to block that call or to treat that call any differently. But the rules say that they can't give that visual indicator if the attestation level is B, right? Now, as we get further into STIR/SHAKEN and how it interplays with some of the other kind of pre-STIR/SHAKEN technologies out there, you know, we'll see attestation B and attestation A drive some differences in how the analytics platforms work. But today, the key difference between A and B is the presence of a check mark or a V in the brackets on a wireline phone. So the kind of regulatory recap and impact here, right? So December 2019 was when the Trace Act, the Pallone-Thune Trace Act, was passed, and there were some deadlines given for carriers to deploy robocall mitigation program and or a STIR/SHAKEN implementation on the IP portions of the network, and they had to register in this database, in this FCC database called the Robocall Mitigation Database. And so the second piece, the carriers registering in the FCC DB, came with some very strict compliance requirements from the FCC. So as of September 28th, 2021, intermediate service providers, terminating service providers are prohibited from taking calls from unregistered carriers. So if there's a carrier out there that doesn't have an entry in the robocall mitigation database, as of right now, the transit carriers and terminating carriers are supposed to be blocking traffic from those guys. Now, in practice, there are still, most carriers are still working to figure out their strategy for identifying whether the originating carrier is actually registered in the database or not. Neustar has a service offering. We're rapidly deploying with many of our customers to help provide them some guidance. But the objective is really here to get to, by the middle of next year, to have all carriers implementing stir shaken. Even the ones that have some technical limitations today, we have some workarounds for them to allow them to be compliant. And so that's kind of the timeline for that. And you can see the FCC becoming increasingly aggressive around compliance with stir shaken. And that's not just because of the capabilities that it delivers today in terms of identifying and enabling trace back for spoofed calls or for bad actors, but it also enables a very sort of robust roadmap for enterprises to help rebuild trust in the brand, rebuild brand trust in the voice channel. And we'll talk a little bit about that later too. So as of today, I think we have about 1,700 carriers that have implemented stir shaken according to the robocall mitigation database. And there is a designation of sort of partial implementation. So this counts partial implementations where the carrier maybe has part of their network is TDM, SS7, and part of their network is IP. And so they've deployed stir shaken on the IP part of their network. The countries, there's 127 countries represented in the FCC database, and over 4,000 carriers have implemented some kind of robocall mitigation program, right? So you got to remember there were other products and services around pre-stir shaken that were designed to help kind of identify and mitigate the effects of unwanted and illegal robocalls on consumers. And so that's why you see a lot of robocall mitigation programs in place, and that were in place even prior to the deadlines, and those have gone up because in most cases in a lot of cases the robocall mitigation programs can be either stricter onboarding measures, which is sort of like a paper exercise, or it can be a sort of post, like a per call analytics thing right at the end of the call, which is a little bit of an easier implementation than implementing stir shaken into the call setup and termination path, right? So that's why you see the variance there in robocall mitigation programs versus implemented stir shaken.
Susan, can I?
Poll question.
Yep, Susan, can you put up the first poll question, please? So the question is, what challenge do you face for outbound calls? Select all that apply. So I'll give everyone a minute to answer. Everyone can see that, correct? Give it like another 10 seconds, Susan, then if you can put up the results.
We're at 32 of 56 have participated.
Okay. Can you put up the results then?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
I'm very disappointed in the last 24.
Do you see the results?
I do not see the results, unfortunately, no.
There.
Oh, there they are. Yep, there they are. So, I mean, this is interesting. We're seeing a lot of call. Yeah, they're either being blocked or mislabeled as spam, or you have the problem with customers just not answering the phone. Okay, that's consistent with what we're seeing. So thank you. So let me go into the next piece here about what's going on in the marketplace. So if you look at why is stir shaken important to consumers? The thing that we want to talk about here, the consumer really wants to know whether to answer the call or not. Is this call a wanted call or an unwanted call? And Henry just hit on a lot of these points here, but I kind of wanted to take the approach from the consumer's perspective. So 88% of consumers say they do not answer the call if they do not know who's calling. And the consumers don't answer because they don't trust the caller ID. Even if sometimes there's going to be caller ID in there, sometimes they're not. But either way, they don't trust it right now. There's so many calls that are spoofed out there. It's very difficult to trust. What Stir Shaken does is it really restores that trust. And you have, it puts that indicator on the actual screen so you can see this little lock here where this is saying that it's a spoof call. So what happens in Stir Shaken when a call is signed with an A and verified, there's an indicator, right? That check mark, this is what Henry was referring to before. This is what will show up on the consumer's screen. So they'll have an indicator that that this thing has actually been verified. Verizon and T-Mobile are already doing this today. So how are enterprise calls being signed? Well, unfortunately, more than half of the business calls that we see are being signed with something other than an A. So what that means is, a lot of these things are not going to receive the check mark. Most of these calls are not going to receive the check mark if you're getting anything other than an A. And the feedback we're getting from analytics providers is that they suggest anything other than an A is more likely going to be a robocall. And that is an input, that attestation is an input into their analytics algorithm. So they will look at that, how that call has been marked, and then determine how that call is to be treated and what it will actually display on the screen. And with more carriers, as Henry just mentioned on the previous slide, there are more carriers that are actually running these robocall analytics engines now than there were previously. So there's just more traps out there for legitimate calls to actually get stuck in. So what are the enterprises experiencing? Well, according to a recent study by Omdia, the phone channel remains very important to the customer experience. So if you see these stats, 83% of enterprises rank the phone channel as very important to their customer experience. And if you took that a layer deeper, more than half of them say it's the most important channel to their communication and their customer experience. So that's a very important stat. It's saying that the enterprise think it's important, consumers think it's important too. Anytime a consumer wants to resolve something that's they want to resolve quickly, and it's something that's highly personal to them, like maybe they're talking to their doctor or they're talking to a financial advisor, they want to make sure that those things are done via the phone channel. So it remains an important channel. The other thing that this study showed is that 82% of enterprises say that more than 20% of their calls are being marked as spam. So these are legitimate calls in most part, or they're going to be mislabeled as spam to these analytics engines. And 50% of these enterprises are saying that their revenue has declined between 11 and 20% due to these calls being mislabeled or blocked. So if you take all these things together, right, you have a very skeptical consumer that doesn't like answering because they really don't trust the caller ID. They more often than not, if they don't know who's calling, they're not going to pick up. It's a very important channel. The consumers and the enterprises agree this is an important channel to them. So they want to use this channel, but there's a lack of trust right now. And a lot of these legitimate calls are getting caught up in these analytics engines and are not getting through. And it's having a negative draw on or a negative drain, I should say, on the enterprises. They're losing money because of this. And the underlying causes are a couple different things. These enterprise calls are not receiving the highest attestation level. And you're also having the problem with these analytics engines looking at anything that's not an A, that they're going to potentially treat unfavorably. And then more carriers are running these analytics engines as well. Let me turn it back over to Henry. He's going to take us through how do we solve this, right? We're not getting a lot of A's. We've got an attestation problem. How do we actually solve this thing we call the attestation gap?
Sure, thanks, Bart. Okay, so we do talk about this enterprise authentication gap, and we talk about the attestation gap a lot. As most of you, I would assume, know, we have a direct enterprise sales team that goes out and engages with primarily, financial, healthcare, government verticals, and sells risk abatement solutions to those types of enterprises. And what we find when we engage with a lot of those enterprises is that, over time through acquisitions or other sort of network optimizations, they find themselves with a really distributed a really distributed architecture. Maybe it's by business unit or business function, different platforms for different call strategies, and all of this sort of fragmentation, even within a company, lends itself to leads enterprises into this gap, right? And so, if the challenge of the enterprise gap is that you're getting calls out that are labeled as a B, and the analytics providers start looking at that B level attestation as a kind of maybe a negative mark on the reputation score, then you start to see more tagging, right? Like you may see calls being more likely to be tagged than they would be if they get an A-level attestation. There's a question in the Q&A that we'll address a little bit later of kind of the long-term view of STIR/SHAKEN and how it interplays with the analytics providers. But what we have here, and what we've been working with our enterprise customers on, is basically taking the STIR/SHAKEN framework. And if you'll recall, when I explained it in the beginning, STIR/SHAKEN exists today within what we call the NNI, right? The network-to-network interface between carriers, right? The carriers are authorized by the SHAKEN framework to sign calls and to decode calls. Our product suite extends that STIR/SHAKEN framework to the enterprise edge, right? So that the enterprise can actually deploy STIR/SHAKEN on their telephony environment and sign the calls themselves, create their own SIP identity headers. If that SIP identity header information gets transmitted end to end and is consumed eventually by the TSP, then you actually have a definitive indicator that the enterprise made that call, right? And so at that point, the terminating service providers can deploy policies that say, if I see a call, I know that enterprise X signs all of their calls. So if I don't see a passport, a STIR passport with an identity header on a call coming from an enterprise X phone number, I'll just tear that call down and I won't let it go through, right? And it allows for a more aggressive posture from the terminating side to help combat spoofing. We've seen in financial use cases a huge uptick of scams, especially post-COVID, right? Utilities, insurance companies, healthcare, banking, where someone will spoof a phone number from a trusted call, or they'll use an SMS campaign to indicate to a caller to expect a call from XYZ utility, and then they'll tell that unsuspecting subscriber at the other end, you need to make a Zelle payment today or a Cash App payment today to avoid having your service discontinued or your account frozen or whatever. And unsuspecting or uneducated consumers are falling for these every day. And they end up doing these transfers and enabling this fraud. And we've really tried to take an extremely aggressive approach with deploying our software to the enterprise edge to help abate that and to make sure that these calls get through, not just with an A-level attestation, but with what we call first-party authentication. So meaning that the first party the first party to handle the call, which is the enterprise, actually provides their own identity header that can be verified at the far end. So to take a step back and talk about why this is, why this creates a problem, right? Let's just, I think there's a build here, Bart, that you can kind of slide through. I always just like to kind of look at them side by side. Let's just say that an enterprise uses, a certain OSP, we'll call them originating service provider number 1 and originating service provider number 2, and they have these in sort of a kind of a round robin traffic sharing approach for least cost routing or for diversity or availability or some other regulatory requirement or availability requirements that the business may have. The calling phone number, though, might be the same, right? Like if it's a business unit that's calling, you want the same calling number to go out because that's what the consumer is likely to call back if they miss the call. So when the call goes out to OSP1, if the phone number came from TNSP1, which is the same carrier, then when that call reaches the mobile subscriber or the wireline subscriber, it's going to show that visual verification. 5 minutes later, you could attempt to call back, right? Like maybe there's a little bit of telephone tag happening there, where the subscriber calls in, doesn't get to the representative that they were trying to reach, and they leave a message, and then you call them back. But the second call takes the alternate route across OSP2. That call comes in and it doesn't have a verification tag. Right now, the verification indicator is kind of subtle, but as the carriers evolve the roadmap for stir shaken and for branded calling, this will become a lot more evident, right? And so the consumer is likely to not answer that second call because it's not verified, or because the call wasn't verified and given an A-level attestation, it gets tagged by the analytics provider as a spam call. We actually have a quite common use case with some of our banking customers, and I'm talking about top 5 banks in the U.S. where they implement a callback queue, right? So consumer calls in to customer service. He's waiting in queue for, he or she is waiting in queue for a representative to be available. They get the option to press 1 to get a call back, right? So they press 1, they put in their mobile number. When the call goes out, because it doesn't get an A-level attestation, it gets a B-level attestation. The analytics provider looks at that number, says, oh, that came from an auto dialer, and they slap a spam tag on it. What's the likelihood, even though the consumer's expecting a call back from their bank, what's the likelihood the consumer's going to answer that call that says spam likely, even though it's coming from the phone number of the bank that they just called, right? And that's a very real live use case that happens every day with almost every single one of our banking customers. And that's one of the driving forces behind this end-to-end authentication. So how do you overcome the attestation gap? There's a few different industry solutions out there, right? So there's 2 ways for an enterprise to do end-to-end authentication. And both of them, the first 2, the STIR certificate and shaken certificate delegation, have to do with the enterprise actually signing their own calls. The only difference between these 2 options are who the signing authority is, right? So shaken certificate delegation is a newly released capability where a TN service provider, like let's say Inteliquent or Peerless or Bandwidth or Twilio or someone like that, you get your phone numbers from them, but you also use another carrier. Those carriers, those wholesale carriers, can actually issue a delegated certificate from their CA, right? That authorizes an enterprise to sign calls with a specific list of TNs that have been assigned to that particular business, right? And it's a great solution because the certificate chains all the way back to the root of the shaken framework, right? So it's tightly buckled to the actual shaken framework that's authorized by the government. The issue with that or the limitation with that is that not all carriers are participating in certificate delegation, right? Some of the big ones like AT&T and Verizon have said publicly, although we are working very hard to change their mind, that they're not going to issue delegated certificates to their customers. So if you get your phone numbers from AT&T or Verizon, well, then what do you do if you want to sign calls? So that's where Neustar kind of put on our, sort of twirly beanie caps, and we came up with this other mechanism where we said, we'll work with a group of originating service providers who have embraced the concept of enterprise signing, and we'll establish a process with them whereby they can trust our certificates, right? So outside of the shaken framework, Neustar can go and do vetting against the TN list. Like, so an enterprise gives us their telephone number inventory, and we'll go through and we'll validate that the enterprise itself is a legitimate business and they've been in business for X amount of years. We know their address. We know their reputational risk through Dun and Bradstreet or Thomson Reuters or some other third party data source. We can validate the calling name of the business matches the business that we're vetting. We have a number of sources that we can use to kind of prove that the enterprise has the right to use that number. And then we can issue a private certificate out of our CA that the enterprise can use to sign. And because that certificate gets terminated by the OSP and the information from that certificate gets ingested into their STIR/SHAKE environment, and then they apply that same information into their SHAKEN passport, which goes through the network to network interface. It goes through and it gives the carrier a way to not only trace back who authorized that call to be attested as an A, but it also gives the carrier a sort of a business reason to do attestation elevation, and it again provides the benefit of first party authentication. There's an alternative to that, which is the telephone number database solution. So these, there's different options for this, right? Some of our carrier customers have local databases where they say, look, we know who all of our key customers are. We've been doing business with them for years and years and years. We trust our customers. We have, ironclad terms in our MSAs around, what numbers they're allowed to use and what numbers they're not allowed to use. So based on our business relationship, we want to elevate the attestation for these particular customers, right? Even if they're using phone numbers that we didn't assign. And that's a business decision that a carrier can make, right? And our technology enables them to make that policy decision using a database that's part of their STIR/SHAKE implementation. There's another industry initiative underway that's being led by primarily promoted by AT&T and Verizon for enterprises to register into a central database where they load all of their information into a centralized database that's then made available somehow for either through query or replication or some kind of DNS kind of zone transfer technology that would give a list of numbers that are authorized, but it doesn't facilitate traceback. It doesn't facilitate. It doesn't really provide any value add in terms of tying the actual call event back to the enterprise that made the call. It only really looks at the calling number to see if the calling number should be elevated or not. It doesn't look at the entire call path the way that the prior two solutions do. So that's really the key differentiator there is with the STIR certificate or the delegated certificate, the enterprise is signing the call, establishing first-party authentication, which is verifiable from end to end. The telephone number database solutions really only provide an analysis of what's the carrier's perspective of that calling number and whether that calling number should be trusted or not. So what happens when we do it when there's a STIR certificate initiated, right? So as I said, what happens is the enterprise, gives us their telephone number inventory. We go through and vet it. Out of our private CA, we issue a STIR certificate. The enterprise, when they send their calls, they can send calls to OSP1 unsigned because they're using the phone number from OSP1, right? When they send calls to OSP2, they can sign those calls with the STIR certificate from Neustar, and then OSP2 will basically drop that certificate and then re-sign with the SHAKEN with an A-level attestation and their SHAKEN passport. It's also a big industry push from a lot of what I like to call the T market cap companies. So if you think about like which companies in the US have a $1 trillion plus market cap, right? Those companies are pushing very hard for their authentication that they place at the point of origin to actually be transited in a stacked fashion so that it's consumable by the terminating service provider. So today the spec says that the OSP should ingest that delegated certificate or that enterprise certificate and only issue their SHAKEN passport with the claims inside of it. But what the big businesses want is they want their enterprise passport that they issued to be passed along all the way to the far end, and I'll explain why in a couple of moments, or in a couple of maybe in the next section, I think.
Okay, so this is our next poll question. How important is attestation elevation to your business? Extremely important, important, somewhat important, not important, don't know. And we're just on a time check. We got like 20 minutes left, buddy.
So does that mean I need to go faster or slower?
Faster, I think.
All right.
All right, Susan, want to get?
I'm kind of like a dog. I have no sense of time.
Extremely important or important. Wow, okay, that's good to see.
That's okay. Pretty good majority.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is what we were talking about: end-to-end authentication. I think Bart, you were going to handle the first part of this, right? Or right?
Sure, I can handle this. So the point I was trying to make here is like, let's say that even if both carriers were to receive an A, or I'm sorry, both calls were to receive an A, right? In this case, I'm making the analogy to like a check. If someone were to receive both of these checks, the checks are identical, but the source is different, right? And is the recipient going to treat both of these things the same way? I'm looking at this one. It's a corporate check signed by a corporate officer from a respected bank that I know. This is signed by a college student from some bank I've never heard of. And yes, the rest of the information is identical, but I'm not going to treat it the same way.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. So, so the impact that we have, right? And so this is where I think we had a question in the Q&A, right? That will SurfShake and eventually eliminate the need for or reduce or minimize the impact of the analytics providers. And I think the ones that were called out were Haya, First Orion, TNS Sequent, right, which covers AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, US Cellular, respectively. The answer is I guess over the long term, perhaps, right? But there are things that the analytics engines do today that are value adds, right, for the consumer, for consumer information, right? Like they have robust databases that categorize calls and can provide information on the category of a call, right? If there's no calling name present, they can say, well, this is a political survey, or this is a telemarketing call, or this is a whatever, and maybe it's not a a spam tag, but it is a call treatment that the terminating carriers find valuable, right? But what we're looking for here is, we're looking for the TSPs to basically take the certificates that get received when an enterprise signs the call, and the terminating service provider sees that not only did the carrier give a shaken certificate with an A, but there's also an enterprise certificate that has the same information provided there, then they can actually make that make a decision to treat that call with a higher level of trust, right? Versus a call that comes in and it gets applied. There's a policy that gets applied that says, well, I'm going to give this call a B. If the difference, if there's on a score of 0 to 100, because you're using a dialer solution, right? And dialers are always kind of in the suspect because they trigger the algorithms. Or if you're in a particular, your call campaign strategy that customers react poorly to, like collections activity, some telemarketing activity, then what ends up happening is the call, if it's scored at an 80 with a B level attestation, right? And that would result in a tag that says, spam with a question mark. If you get an A-level attestation, then maybe that gets, bumped down to a 70, and then there's, no labeling, right? And if there's an enterprise certificate there, then maybe that gets, passed along with no labeling plus the verified call indicator, right? And as the standards progress, there's also the possibility of passing along the business name, the call reason, a logo. These are all enhancements to the to the policy that are to the protocol that are going to add additional value. In the end-to-end authentication use case, what our proposal is, and what we've been working with a couple of big banks and big tech companies on, is making sure that this rich call data passport from the enterprise is present. And so that way, if a spoofer gets a hold of a bank's phone number and they're calling in, and a call comes into the TSP, and maybe it gets an A-level attestation, right? Because there's, some gap in the policy that the carrier has, or the number was, the number was procured, legitimately, and then sent along the path. What having that enterprise first party authentication there will do is allow the TSP to basically say, you know what, I see the enterprise certificate there. I know that enterprise made that call now. I'm not relying on carrier policy, which you got to remember, these carriers, most of them are dealing with, hundreds of thousands of business customers and millions of phone numbers, and their ability to, apply policy at a very discrete level is something that's going to take time to adopt, because they're big carriers and these are big changes to their infrastructure. And so, what our proposal is to go attack it at the enterprise level and let the enterprise sign the call and provide their own verification and their own, cryptographic security that can then be interpreted by the terminating service provider, so that if there's any disparity between what the originating carrier does from a policy perspective, that terminating service provider always respects the first party authentication that's attached by the enterprise, right? And so what we really want is we want to be able to sort of knock down any calls that don't have first party authentication. That's the end state we'd like to get to.
Okay, thanks, Henry. So let's talk about the call experience in general, right? So, I mean, everyone wants to use the phone channel. The phone channel is very important. It's lost its way along the way, right? It's that the trust has been lost. What we've been talking about up to now is, well, how do we get that trust back? And that's all about authentication and stir shake. It's very important to get that trust back. Authentication is really the underpinnings for all the rest of this to work. So, but I wonder if you can change this, and you can just enhance and elevate and transform the call experience altogether. Give the enterprise the ability to send identity and context to the recipient of the call. This would restore trust in the phone calls, protects the consumer so they're not getting spam calls that are being used for fraud, and then also it improves the customer engagement. So how do we actually do that? Well, this is where we start talking about branded calling. What branded calling is, it really allows you to deliver deliver brand information, right? I can actually deliver a logo. I can deliver images, an e-card, so that I can actually deliver something that represents my brand. It reinforces the brand with my customer or a prospect that this is me, and I'm able to display information to make sure that someone answers the phone. For me, like when my financial advisor called me once a year, I miss the call almost every time because I don't know that it's him calling, and I let it go to voicemail. This would be something that'd be really helpful if he had that it would say, he could have his business card there. The reason for your call is your 4 o'clock appointment. You can see how this could be very helpful. And you can add this personalized message, and then you can also have a trusted call, right? So if nothing else, if the call is not trusted, we've just created a more attractive version of spam for fraud, right? We have to make sure that this is authenticated, because if it's not authenticated, we've probably done more harm than good. So does branded calling really? Go ahead.
Hey Bart, can you go back one slide? I just wanted to kind of add one point, and I'll be brief. When businesses are looking at their outbound call strategy, the value of a branded call, right? The value of a branded call should really be tied to not necessarily call success rate or call answer rate, but really like the yield, the KPI yield of that outbound call campaign strategy. Because when you're passing this much information on the call screen and in the call log, you're actually delivering a ton of value to the consumer, even if they don't answer the call, right? And so let's say, for example, it's a collections call. If somebody gets a call and they don't answer the call because they're busy, but they see calling about your payment, calling about payment due, right? The subscriber may just go, oh, wow, I forgot to make that payment, and go online and make the payment. And now the business has gotten yield, right, from the outbound call campaign, even though the call wasn't connected, right? And so the value proposition of a branded call goes far beyond just the sort of standard metrics that you see in kind of outbound call center performance rates, right? And so when we engage with our enterprise customers, we always try and drill into like, what's the goal? Like, what's the yield goal for this outbound call strategy? And then as we implement the services, we have them measure not just the standard KPIs, but also like, what's the impact of the KPI for that particular, the yield for that particular business activity. That's all.
Yeah. Thank you, Henry. And that's exactly right. So like what the first metric here that we often see is about answer rates, right? And Henry's absolutely right. That's sort of like the very first thing, but there's a lot of other things that you can see improvement on. And this goes across all different industries. You can see it goes from financial lenders all the way down to rideshare service guys, but they're receiving an improvement just in people answering the phone. That's sort of step one. But you're also seeing an improvement in customer retention and win back. And you're also seeing an improvement in terms of how long the duration of the call. So all those things Henry just said, yes, those are key things to be looking at as you're evaluating how well this call platform is actually working, and how the branded calling is actually working. All right, so we're kind of running out of time here, Henry. Do we want to move through this, or do you want to hit on this really quickly? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I think there was a question in the Q&A, right, about all of this, right? So this particular use case, that there are lots of companies out there that their business model is to provide a calling platform for industry specific types of customers, right? And for things like prescription refill notifications or appointment reminders or things like that, where there's these kind of niche call platform providers that provide these services, but they're using phone numbers that don't belong to them. The phone numbers belong to the doctor or the retail pharmacy or the hospital that the doctor is an attending physician at, right? There's a number of different use cases where there's spoofing that's happening, but the spoofing is actually legitimate. It's authorized. It's authorized by the brand, and the business is being conducted legitimately. And this process of this end-to-end authentication and and more importantly, the vetting that goes up, that happens in the front end for issuing the certificate so that the attestation elevation happens, is really key to making sure that these strategies continue to be successful. And that's really kind of the case study here that we've been talking about. And I think I hope that answers, that particular one of our questions that came in from trying to understand that. And I'm going to try and answer some of these questions in here. I'm going to try and type some answers to some of these questions that we're not going to have time to get to.
Okay. Do you want to hit on the Trust Lab first?
Yeah, I mean, certainly can. So we have, when robocalling first came out, we started, we ran this robocalling testbed for ATIS, for the American Standards Institute, right, to come up with some common best practices for how to manage these robocalling analytics platforms. And then we expanded that to do certification for stir shaken platforms. And so we are now have expanded our trust lab to allow enterprises and other other players in the industry to come in and to come in and participate in the trust lab and work on interoperability solutions with their particular technology, right? And a lot of there's a lot of innovation that's happening, particularly in the contact center environment, where there's lots of automation that can take place, lots of use of WebRTC. And so in these environments where the provider has a lot of control over the call flow, we provide an environment where you can do some fast-paced prototyping. So to get more information, go to the link below and put in your information, your use case, and someone will contact you, and we can kind of get to work on it.
Okay, great. All right, so let me just recap here some of the things that we talked about today. So the industry is going to continue to evolve, right? Stir shaking is a big step forward in stopping bad actors, specifically around call spoofing and restoring trust in the caller ID. And the deployments will continue. There was a requirement as of June 30 that all carriers by June 30 of next year, and potentially 2023, that all carriers will have to implement stir shaking. That's still evolving as well. There's a lot of legitimate calls that are not getting through. We talked about this. They're not receiving aid due to complexities in signing. More robocall mitigation programs are out there, so more calls are getting stuck in these traps. So one of the solutions that we talked about is allowing enterprise and contact centers to participate. Raise the attestation level by using one of these different approaches that we talked through, and enable end-to-end authentication. And then we also talked about authenticating is just the foundation, right? This is laying the foundation for really transforming the calling experience. So without verification, we're just creating better looking spam. We want to make sure that we're building something that allows the phone channel to bring back the trust that we've had in the past, and make sure that consumers start picking up the phone again. And all of this is to say, let customers know it's you calling, and so they'll answer, right? That's really what we're trying to get to. Quickly on next steps, we examine some next steps for enterprises. Examine the existing call practices you have. Look at the phone numbers. We work with a lot of enterprises, and one of the first things we do is look at their phone numbers, and oftentimes they don't have a good handle on their phone numbers. So start there. Look at what you have in your inventory. Look at what your call policies are. See how your calls are being signed today by your carrier. And then explore signing calls on your own. Work with your OSP or your TNSP and obtain a delegate certificate. Partner with someone that, a provider that understands all the regulations and technologies and standards that are changing all the time. That's something we do. That is our core. So we'd be happy to have conversations with anyone about those types of issues. And then join the Trust Lab that Henry just heard on before. So we have one last poll question here. I think Henry's feverishly answering questions in the Q&A as we're going through this, but we have one last poll question. So I'll give it another couple seconds here so we can get to some questions. Okay, Susan, can you just put up the result there, please? Okay, so it looks like we kind of have a mixed bag. Everyone, some people are just educating themselves, and it looks like you have a lot of people evaluating different alternatives here as well. So that's probably the two biggest buckets that I see. Are there any questions here, Henry, that you wanted to answer verbally that you haven't already gotten to? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, let me just scan through them real quick here. Let's see. So from Sage Johnson, why should I invest in signing my own calls? I mean, I think it's really case dependent, right? Like if you are if you're adversely impacted by stir shaken and you know that you're adversely impacted because of your business model, then it makes sense to invest in the call signing, right? But let me tie this to the next question, right? Which is the next question from an anonymous attendee says, my carrier says they're going to mark all my calls an A, so I don't have a problem, right? So if your use case is that where you use one carrier, you get all your numbers from them, they say all your calls are an A, then you really don't have an immediate problem to solve, right? There may be some long-term opportunities, down the road, like over the next year or 2 years, for you to sign your own calls for rich call data to push brand information along, like we spoke to on towards the tail end of the presentation. That the carriers may not offer that right away, or they may want that information to be hosted by the enterprise. So there may be other reasons for you to invest in signing your own calls as time goes on. But if you know that all your calls are getting an A today, then you really probably are not going to have a problem or a business driver, right? So I had a couple comments along, a couple of these questions are all along the same vein, right? Which was the use case we tried to hit on, right? Where we have a lot of call platforms that use their clients' numbers. This is whether you're a BPO, right? Or if you are running a CPaaS platform that does, automated call notifications for a particular type of business. Your client is who owns the number, right? And that's who needs to get the certificate. And so in the scenario where, depending on who your clients are and how distributed they are across the country they are, and how many different carriers they use, managing delegated certificates from all of their carriers and then pushing those upstream to a platform that you can use to then sign them could be a kind of heavy process, right? Which is why we have this alternative of the enterprise certificate, where we'll vet your entire telephone number inventory that you're using for your entire client base. We'll actually look at the clients themselves. We'll validate the clients themselves and their right to use those phone numbers, as opposed to vetting that you as a call platform have a right to use the number. We'll look at we'll actually look at your end client and see if we can associate your end client with the phone number that they're calling from, right? And then as long as you have your documentation in order that can prove that that that's your client, and then they're authorizing you to make calls on their behalf, which should be like a standard part of your MSA with your clients, then we have a kind of a sort of a paper trail of trust that we can use to implement an enterprise certificate, right? So that's really what that is about. Next question was, does a carrier need to have implemented stir shaken by September 28th not to be blocked? The answer is no. They just needed to have a registration in the robocall mitigation database that indicated what their status was. Do they have it fully deployed, partially deployed? Are they doing robocall mitigation? What are their timelines? And so, that's why there's a, most carriers were able to meet that June 30th deadline. I don't know of too many that didn't meet the June 30th deadline for registering in the database, but there was a June 30th deadline for implementing stir shaken, but there's no enforcement action currently for carriers that didn't get stir shaken completely implemented by June 30th or even September 28th. Okay, so these, I'll try and answer the last one first, which is, how do I confirm my outbound provider is giving an A-level attestation? One way to do it, one easy way to do it is to grab a mobile phone and call your mobile phone. And if you have an iPhone, you can actually look in your call log, and inside your call log, the call that comes in from your outbound call center or whatever platform you're calling from, if in the call log you see a little gray check mark under the phone number, you can actually click the info button and it'll tell you calls with a check mark have been verified by the carrier. And that little gray check mark, iPhones are the most subtle because you can only see it in the call log or in the voicemail screen if the call's been verified with StirShaken. But that little gray check mark will be present. On Android phones and especially on Google phones that have Google verified calling enabled, you'll see on the incoming call screen, verified call from. And so there's a couple different ways. My advice is to get, a few different handsets from a few different carriers and place calls to those handsets, and then inspect what the incoming call screen looks like and what the call log screen looks like. And then also, obviously have a conversation with your outbound carrier, right? With your outbound provider. Last one, not all enterprises make 100% of their calls themselves relying on outsourcers. How do you make sure outsourcers calling on behalf of the enterprise get their calls, attestation, and reduce the likelihood of poor labels? This is exactly the use case again, right? Like what we suggest is work with us. Let us vet your customers and their phone numbers. And as long as your paper lines up to where, you can prove that you have the contractual, that you have the authorization from that business to use those phone numbers, then we can actually implement StirShaken with you, issue you a certificate, and then you can do your own signing and get an A-level attestation. And that, there are some caveats and nuances there that would probably be better handled kind of, on a one-on-one call or on a sort of follow-up call where we know a little bit more about your infrastructure and which carriers you're dealing with and so on and so forth. But in general, this problem statement is the one that we're really trying to solve the most, right? With this is the two big use cases are, I'm a big brand that wants an aggressive posture to protect my calls from being spoofed. That's one big push for enterprises to sign calls. The other big push for enterprises to sign calls is I'm making calls from phone numbers that aren't mine. I'm allowed to use them because I'm providing a service for the person who owns the phone number, but my entire business model breaks StirShaken. So how do I get an A, and how do I keep from getting tagged, right? And that's the value prop. And we have quite a few CPaaS providers and BPOs and call center, contact center companies that we work with today to provide this capability so that we can ensure that those customers get an A. And okay. Last one, how do you maintain your vetting over time? We see hundreds of thousands poured in and out in a given month. How do you keep up with network and numbering changes? So we have ways to monitor, CSRs for port records. And we have, a lot of access to industry database information. We do keep track of that. What we also do is, periodic vetting on the entire inventory. When we do the reason we do vetting and the reason why we charge for it is because we have to do it over time. We have to maintain it over time. Hundreds of thousands porting in and out in a given month, may require some special customization, right? That is tuned to that. That's quite a bit, right? Like we see, some of our biggest carrier customers, our biggest wholesale carrier customers, have that volume of port in and port out. So within a contact center environment or an enterprise environment, that's an extraordinarily high volume. So I'd want to dig into that a little bit, and we would likely, look at some custom automation there to make sure that, your records of port in and port outs gets reflected in the certificates that we issue you for signing, so that the TN auth list matches up with numbers that are actually assigned to you. And that's it. I think that's the cue. All right. Oh no, actually there's still more coming in, but I don't know if we have time. I have time, but I don't know if anybody else has time.
Well, we can collect the questions and provide those to you and Bart if you would like, Henry, and you can answer them later. Or I know that Bart just shared an email address that they can email to as well or call. And so I think we can follow up later. I also want to remind everybody that Pace will upload this to our website, so you have an opportunity to enjoy it again. as well as both Pace and Neustar will be sharing it in our social media channels. So I want to thank everybody for listening today. A special thank you to our sponsor and our Diamond partner, Neustar, as well as our speakers today, Bart and Henry. This was extraordinary, and a lot of really great feedback and comments about how informational this was. So thank you all.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.